Welcome back. My name is Chris, and in this video, I'm going to be walking you through the fundamentals of workflows, including both a single state workflow and an example of a multi-state approval workflow. So just to understand, what is a workflow? A workflow is basically an automation that you set up in NetSuite, and you can use these automations for a number of different things. You can use them to fill in certain fields, or have certain, again, as the example I'm going to give, you can set up certain workflows, a lot of different basically opportunities that you can get from setting up these workflows. Now, there are similarities between workflows and suite scripts, the difference being that to create a suite script, you do have to have developer or programming knowledge. So the benefit of using a workflow is the fact that once, just in the course of watching this video, you'll be able to understand them pretty rapidly and be able to utilize them with no programming background. Now, it's not that they are exclusive where you would just use a suite script as opposed to a workflow. In many instances, you want to create both and use them in tandem to fit your exact needs for your NetSuite. So without further ado, let's get into this and check out making a workflow. So here I am in my home dashboard, and I'm going to go over to customization down to workflows, and then over, and I'm going to hit new on workflows. Now it brings me to this page to create a new workflow. I do want to make a note of the fact that if you click on this from template, there are a few basic workflow templates that are already existing. And if you take a look at them and find that one of them fits your needs, by all means use them. But in most cases, you'll want to create something specific. So we're going to go up to new workflow. And let's give an example of why we would want to use a workflow. So up here, I have a customer. And let's say I want to create a situation where whenever any new sales order is being generated, I want the sales order, the preferred payment method for that sales order to fill in automatically based on whatever the customer that's selected, what that person's preferred payment method is. So right now we're taking a look at a customer. This is the first customer we have available was Devavu Company. And if I scroll down here, you'll see, if I come down here, preferred payment method is Visa. So this customer, not all the customers, but this one particularly has a preferred payment method listed as Visa. So if I go to sales order, so let's say I'm creating a new sales order, and in this field, I select the customer. So let's select Devavu. So now that I've selected the customer, if I go down here to billing, notice the payment method is blank. So there's nothing set up to recognize that because this customer has a preferred payment method, it should be selected for this field. But that's where workflows can come in, and they can be created to set up that automatic field basically filling in. So we're going to set up this very simple workflow to create that effect. So I'm going to come back to my workflow here. And first off, we have name. So we're going to name what this workflow is referred to as. So we're going to call it preferred payment method. And now I'm going to go up here to record type. So similar to when we're doing save searches, etc., it's going to ask us what type of record we're dealing with. And we're dealing with, in this case, sales order. So a sales order is a type of transaction as opposed to, let's say, an entity if we're dealing with a customer workflow. So we're going to hit transaction on that. And then we're going to select the subtype. So now that we've selected transaction, it gives us all the various types of transactions available. So we're going to go down to sales order. Now we could select multiple. In other words, this workflow could affect many different types of transactions. In this case, we're just going to be dealing with a sales order. So we can also add a description. You should list it just so that anyone else coming in and checking out the workflow will automatically know what that workflow is influencing, as opposed to going through it and trying to figure out just based on the various actions listed. So a description can be very helpful. And of course, the owner is just going to default to whatever role you're currently in. So I'm here as Catherine Glass in the administrator role. So it defaults to that. Next thing down, we have execute as admin. So that's basically going to specify that this workflow is going to operate as if an administrator and have the approvals of an administrator. So in many cases, it's good to have that so it can override instances where it might be doing something that go beyond the access of an administrator. And certainly if you're setting up this workflow to do some certain action, in many cases, you will want it to take that administrator access so that it's not getting slowed up by the actions that it's doing or the various permissions that are allowed by the user. So we're going to hit OK on execute as admin. Next down from that, we have release status. So we've got 4 different types of release status. And really what you're stating here is that once you create this workflow, How is it going to operate? Is it going to operate immediately, which is, if we start at the bottom here, released is saying that as soon as we save that workflow, it's immediately in action and it's going to start influencing, in this case, sales orders. So in this case, I am working in a demo account, so it's fine to set up as released, and then I can immediately test it and see if it's working appropriately and it won't affect any real account. So I'm going to hit released. Down from that, we have keep instance and history. So this is used to actually basically specify to the system that it should keep logs on what this workflow is doing. And in many instances, it's good to have that, because then if you run into problems later down the line, or even in the process of testing it, you can look at the logs and try to see where the workflow is going wonky. So the only reason why you would maybe not want to set those logs is because if the workflow is doing a lot of different things, or maybe if a lot of transactions are going through that workflow, it can create a ton of records and a ton of logs that could slow down your system by logging every single instance in which that workflow is going. So in this case, we're going to set it to always, and we're going to say enable logging, because we do want to see the logs for how this thing is operating. Next thing down, we have initiation. So there's two options. There's event-based and scheduled. Event-based is the most common, and that's basically saying that some event or action will actually trigger this workflow to act. And as we go on, you'll understand what are some of those triggers, but that is by far the most common. Scheduled is, as the name implies, going to set up some sort of schedule, like maybe once a week or whatever you're going to specify, in which the workflow will run. And there are certain instances where you might want to set up a scheduled workflow where it maybe checks all your customers and maybe creates a log or a report that gets generated based on certain ones that fit a certain criteria, or create certain actions on them based on that. But in most workflow instances, you will want to have them occur based on some sort of an event. So we're going to leave it, certainly for our example here, we're going to leave it as event-based. Next, down from that, we have event definition. So really the two things we're going to look at here, we have on create or on view or update. And you can't, it's not a one or the other, you can't select both. And on create basically says that on the creation of, and in this case, we're talking about sales orders. So on the creation of a sales order, this workflow will go into action, or will have the possibility of enacting, as opposed to on view or update, which basically means that, let's say if a sales order is already created, then someone goes and edits a sales order, just the fact of editing it could then trigger this workflow to start newly. So in this case, because we're going to be setting a preferred payment method, really we want that just to occur upon the first initiation or creation of a sales order. So we're going to hit on create. Now notice we have a lot of other things here. We've got trigger, event types, conditions, etc. Now I'm not going to explain all these things here, because as we go on a little bit later in this video, I'm going to be walking through what all these different things do, but at an action level, which is a little bit lower down. And that's a better place to understand what these things do. So we're going to leave these blank for now, and we're just going to set that the event enacts on creation, and we're going to skip through this language section and go to save. Okay, so we have our workflow here, and really what we're looking at is on the left-hand side, we have the visual representation of the workflow. So we can see we have a state here, and we have a start point and an end point. And then on the right, it's a bit of a way that you can see what you're dealing with, and you also have the ability to edit things on the right. So in this instance, many of the things that you can do here on the left, which is actually what I'm going to be doing, you can interact with this on the left-hand side. Many of the same things can be done on the right-hand side here. For example, you have this edit pencil and a lot of duplicative ability on either side. I am going to be working mainly on the left-hand side, but do understand you can do some of these same actions on the right side. So really just to orient you here, we have this workflow, or really this is a state that we're looking at, and you consider it kind of a box or a gate in which one or more actions are going to occur when you come into the state and then when you leave the state. And this is what this first example, I'm going to be showing you a single state workflow, which means we're just going to be looking at one state here. But a more common example, just to give you a visual representation of it, is a situation in which you have multiple states. So for example, let's say we drew a line to go from here to here, and then another one to go from state 2 down to either state 3 or state 4. This would be a more common example of a workflow, and this is referred to as a multi-state workflow. So again, there is a time and a place for this. It's quite common, but in this particular instance, we're just going to be dealing with a single state workflow. So I'm deleted those previous ones, and we're just going to be dealing with this one state to achieve our goal of setting the preferred payment method as whatever that customer, if they have it set as a preferred payment method, to default to that. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's click, and we're going to double click on that state. And it pulls up this window here, which shows us this workflow state. And the first thing we're going to change is the actual name of the state. So here we're going to say preferred payment method is the name of this state. And before I actually do anything further, I'm actually going to hit save on this. And the reason for that is before I'm going to start creating actions in the workflow, I actually have to save the workflow state as a state before I can start going in and doing, you could say, edits to that thing. So now that I've created this state, I'm going to double click on it again, and now I'm going to start creating actions. So you can see here we have actions, and I'm going to hit new action, which is going to take me to this page, and it's basically going to ask me, okay, so you want to do an action. We're in this state. We're going to do some action here. And what is the type of action that you want to do? Well, you've got a number of different options here. And as I go through these several options, both with a single state and a multi-state workflow, I'm going to give you an example of some of these options here. But it really depends on what you're trying to do. You have things like you can add buttons, remove buttons, you can lock down certain records, you can fill in certain fields, you can set field values as certain other fields, and a lot of different options here. So in this particular case, what we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to replace the preferred payment method with whatever the customer on the customer record has saved as their preferred payment method. So that type of action is going to be a set field value action. So we're going to click on that. And it brings us to this field. Now scrolling up to the top here, so we can see we're dealing in this state. We can see we've selected this type, which is set field value. And then we're going to go down to the next major thing to deal with is this trigger on. In other words, what is the trigger for this particular action to go into place? So if I click on this, we have a bunch of different options here. There can be entry, meaning the entry into, in this case would be the record, the entering into the sales order. It might be the exiting of the sales order before that sales order even loads, before maybe that record of the sales order is submitted as a saved record. You got a ton of different options here. Now, really where the subtle differences between these come into play is if, let's say you have a lot of different workflows, or especially if you have a workflow that's working alongside a suite script, it might be very important in terms of where this thing is actually triggering, where this specific action is triggering and starting its action. In this particular case, it's not wildly important. For example, the difference between entry or before record load, there would be no difference because we don't have a bunch of complexity here. So they would be doing roughly the same thing. So let's say if I clicked on before record load, based on hitting that trigger, suddenly I have all these event types. So it's saying, and one way to think about this, just as a general way of thinking when you're dealing with workflows, is if you're going down a road and you hit a fork in the road and you can either go left or right, or you could say yes or no or on and off, you're going to hit this fork. It might be two options, it might be more options. But as we go through these various steps, you'll see we're really passing through these gates where we're deciding, okay, we're going to go left. Good. Now we hit another fork. Good. Now we're going to go right. And as you're going through all these gates, you're kind of narrowing down and clarifying what this workflow is, what it's going to be involving, what are the conditions for it to happen, when is it going to happen, what is it going to influence, and it's really just narrowing down as you hit these yes, no, yes, no, yes, no gates all the way along the line. So again, now that we've hit the trigger as before the record loads, it's going to say, okay, well, what is the specific event in which this record is being influenced? Again, the record in this case is the sales order. So is it the copying of a sales order? Is it the creating of a sales order? Maybe editing, emailing, you have all of these different options. If you select none of them, it will basically default to say that it could be any one of these options will trigger this workflow. Now, in this particular case, we're specifying that upon the creation of a sales order, we want it to default the preferred payment method to whatever the customer's is. But that means, again, if we go back to our sales order, now in this case, I selected now that the customer is Devavu, but originally when I created this sales order, the customer field was blank. Now, this record, upon the creation of the sales order, it's not going to know what to fill in that preferred payment method until you specify what the customer is. So in this particular case, if we go back to the workflow, we want the trigger not to be before the record loading or before entering this record. We actually want it to be at the point of after field edit. So if I click on that, and it's saying that after the editing of the field, customer, once the customer field has been edited or selected, then that is going to trigger to go into place, because that's the only point where it could in this particular workflow. So if we go back to workflow, now that we've selected trigger on after field edit, notice you no longer have any event types because now the focus is not on the record itself, but the focus is on a specific field. So by selecting that trigger on after field edit, suddenly we have this area, which you might have noticed before was blanked out. It was not editable. Now that we've selected after field edit, now we have this as an editable selection because the whole point of this section is specifying, okay, now that you know you want to do after field edit, all right, well, what field are we talking about? What is the circumstances in which this is going to be going into action? And in this case, we can select it to either be a body field or a sublist field if the field is in the sublist. Now, in this case, it is a body field, right? If we go back here, the customer field is in the body or the header section of the sales order record. So if we go back here, we're going to leave it as body, and we're going to go through all of these different fields that are available to us, and we're going to select the one that is applicable, which in this case is the customer field. So we're going to go down to customer, and we're going to select that. And then we're going to move down here. Now, before I go any further on this right side, I do want to point out context over here. So context is basically, as the name implies, what is the context in which this workflow or this workflow action going into place, or what is it influencing? So you'll see there's things like actions, clients, CSV imports, all of these different things, and it defaults to select pretty much everything but two different options. It's gonna basically say that this thing can apply to all of these different contexts. Now, the reason that this might come into play is that in many instances, a workflow is created to solve a particular problem. Maybe, for example, you're doing CSV imports and you're running into some difficulty, or there's some issue or some fields that you want to fill in. So you're creating a workflow for that specific context. And if you're in that situation where you are creating it for solving a problem, then instead of having a default to all of these different contexts, you're going to want to narrow it down. You're going to want to deselect everything except for that exact context that you're dealing with. Again, maybe you're creating a web store and you're running into some problems with that. You would want to select the web store option and deselect everything else. Now, in this particular case, we're not trying to solve a problem. We're trying to create a normal automation within our system. So we're going to allow it to be in any context, and all of these other triggers and conditions that we're going to set are going to narrow down what is this thing influencing. So the context here is totally fine. And we're going to jump back up here. So here we have condition. So what is the condition in which this thing is going to place? Well, we've already specified that it's regarding a sales order and that we're going to be influencing based on what customer is being selected. We do want to make sure that when a customer is selected, it's not that every customer has a preferred payment method. Many customers do not have one selected. So we want to set up a condition where we're defaulting that preferred payment method only when the customer does have one listed on the customer record. So that's what we're going to do here. And the way that you can set the condition is two ways. You can either set it through a visual builder, which I'm going to show you in a second, or you can set it with a custom formula. Custom formula does require that you have programming knowledge. The whole point of this video is assuming that you don't have programming knowledge, so I'm not going to show you that for this particular video. We are going to stick with the visual builder. And to enact that, we're going to go over here and click this open button. And it pulls up this is the visual builder that we're looking at here. So what we're looking at here, it's actually pretty straightforward. We need to know, okay, well, what is the thing that we're influencing, or what's the condition that we're basing this off of? So we want to specify that on the customer record, so we're going to set customer. On the customer record, the field preferred payment method, so that's a field that exists on the customer record. When we're dealing with this field, we don't want it to be empty. So if this thing, in other words, the condition in which this workflow is going to run is as long as that preferred payment method is not empty. So we're going to click on this and we're going to say not empty. So that's the only condition that we have. So we're going to add that and we're going to hit save. Good, so we've set that condition. Now, I do want to make a mention of this save search condition. When you create a save search, you set the criteria. So you can actually select, if I click here, it gives me all the various save searches that I have in this NetSuite instance. And you can basically link it to a save search to pull in what those conditions are tied to that save search if that fits your particular needs. In this case, it does not. So we're going to go down. Now, we do have this schedule section. Notice that it's all disabled. And the reason for that is that when we were earlier making this workflow, remember we selected it was event-based, not scheduled-based. So this whole section is disabled because we're not dealing with a scheduled-based workflow. So we're going to go down a little bit further. So this is going to be the field that we're setting on the sales order, which is the payment method. So we're going to click on the field and we're going to put in payment method. So we're going to select that field. And now we're going to say that field, what is the value we want to replace that field with? And you have two options. Well, actually, you have a few options, but really the two options that we have that are applicable in this case is static value. So let's say we always wanted the payment method to be Visa. That's our business model. No matter the customer, we want the preferred payment method to be Visa. We would set it as a static value, but that's not what we want. We want it to be based on this other record. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go down and click from field. And based on this, we're going to select what is this join or this thing that we're being influenced by. And in this case, it is a customer field. So we're going to click customer. And as soon as we've selected that a payment method on our sales order is going to be influenced by a customer field, we now need to specify what is that customer field. And the customer field is preferred payment method. So now that we've selected all of that, we're going to go down here and we're going to hit save. So now, and you'll see here, this was blank before. Now we see this workflow action down here at the bottom that has everything that we specified, that it's a set field value, that it's influencing the preferred payment method for the customer, that it's happening after the field edit, and that it is replacing that field with this join from the customer field. So we're pretty happy with that. So we're going to go down to save. So now that we've saved that, we actually, and remember I selected earlier on in this video, I selected that the release status for this workflow is going to be released, meaning that as soon as we hit save on it, it is now in action. So I don't need to do anything further with this workflow. I can actually test it right now to see if it's working appropriately. So I'm going to go back to this sales order. And in this case, I'm going to, again, if I go down here, remember under billing, the payment method is blank, but this is an old record. So now I'm going to hit refresh on this page. I'm going to hit reload. So it reloads the sales order. So I have to select the customer again. We're going to hit Devavu. And by selecting Devavu, if I come down here and I go to the billing, notice the payment method is now Visa, which was the preferred payment method for the customer Devavu. So we verified in just a few seconds that this workflow is working appropriately, and we've created a successful single state workflow. Now, before I go any further, I do want to make a mention of the fact that I have, if you check out the link below, there is a Super Training Administrators course where we have an entire module on the subject of workflows that really goes into this with some of the same examples, but going into it with much more detail and explanation. So if you want to get more information about workflows, be sure to check that out. And of course, if you're finding this video helpful, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. And of course, if there's certain videos that you'd like to see me make, by all means, let me know in the comments down below what videos you'd like me to make, and I will make it for a future video, whether for the next week or a week coming down the line. Even if you want to just give me feedback, I love hearing back from you guys in the comments. It means a lot to me. So without any further ado, let's now move on to a multi-state workflow. So we're going to go back up to our workflows here. And so this one is saved and fine. So we're going to go back to the home dashboard here. And that's not necessary, but I like to come back here as a square zero. So I'm going to go back up to customization, workflow, workflows, new, just like I did previously. So we have a new workflow. Now in this example, we're going to be creating a multi-state workflow that is an approval workflow. So what is the scenario? Let's say in instances where we have a purchase order, we've set up a company policy where if a purchase order is over $1,000, it needs to go through an approval workflow where either the administrator or the purchasing manager has to approve it before it can go through. Any purchase order under $1,000 will just go through without any approval necessary. So that's the workflow we want to create. Let's do it. So first off, we're going to specify the name. So let's say purchase order approval workflow. I've used this name before, so it automatically fills in. And record type, again, we're going to select transaction because a purchase order is a type of transaction. Notice we have all these subtypes here. So we're going to select purchase order. And again, you should put in a description so that someone can come along, whether it's you at a later time or someone like a consultant, and immediately know what this workflow is doing. It's important to put those descriptions. We're going to again hit execute as admin. And again, release status, we're fine with it being released. We're fine with it being keeping an instance into history and logging this history. And again, event-based, this is an event-based instance because this is the generation of a purchase order that's going to trigger this thing. We don't want to happen on some sort of schedule. So now here on the event definition, we're going to hit on create, but we're also going to hit on view or update. And the reason for that is because we don't want someone to subvert this workflow by, let's say, creating a purchase order and having it only be $500, and then editing the purchase order to be suddenly $2,000. So by selecting both of these, we can make it that any instance where someone's either creating or messing or editing with a purchase order, it will trigger this workflow and the necessary approvals. So again, we have trigger types, event types, conditions, all these different things. But as I mentioned before, in most instances, for most workflows, instead of specifying these various parameters at the workflow level, really you're going to want to dig into the actions and the states and set them at that level. So we're going to leave this as blank. We're going to skip this language section and we're going to hit save on this. So it brings us to this single state workflow here. You'll recognize this from earlier in this video. So we're going to add 2 states and we're going to put them over here and one here at the bottom. So the first thing we're going to do is name these states. So the first state is going to be called pending approval. And we're going to hit save on that state. So now we have that state, and the state that's going to come below it is going to be called approved. The state is where it's been approved and it's now a working state. So we're going to hit save on that. And then this state is going to be called rejected. So this is if it is not approved and it gets rejected, it now goes to that exact state. So we've got these 3 states set up. Okay, so now before I actually do anything, I want to give you an example and really just kind of show you what we're doing here. So if I go up here and I create a new purchase order in a new tab, if we go to this, notice up here, we do not have an approval or approve or rejected button. And notice if we go down here to approval status, it says pending approval. So someone could, at this point in time, open this up and approval status, select this as approved to be able to skip basically any type of approval workflow. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding the 2 buttons for approved or rejected here, and we're going to lock off this approval status field so that someone can't edit this or mess around with it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go back to our workflow, and in this pending approval state, we're going to add an action to add that approved button. So we're going to go up here and you can see this add button type of action. If we click on that, it gives us the ability to notice it still gives us triggers and context and conditions, all that, but we don't need to edit that. Those are totally fine as default. So we're going to come down here and we're going to create this button and we're going to say approved or approved because it's going to be the action of approving it. So we're going to say approve and we're going to scroll down and we're going to hit save. So we've now created a button that allows the person to click on it and hit approve. And we're going to add the same button, but in this case, add button is going to be reject. So again, down here, we're going to click label reject. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to hit save on that button. So we've now added those 2 buttons. And then the third thing we want to do as an action is we want to, if we go back to our purchase order here, we want to disable and lock off this field here. So we're going to go workflow. And the type of action that is going to be a set field display type. So if we click on that, it's going to allow us to set the field. Now the field we're going to be influencing in this case is approval status. So we're going to select that field and we're going to come over here and we can also select whether, in this case it is in the body, but we could also, if it was in a sub list, we could select that. And we're going to go over to display type. You might recognize this from other videos. There's 4 key display types. You can either have it be totally hidden, you can have the ability to be inline edited, or just a normal field that is there, or disabled. And disabled is what we want because we want people to be able to see it, but not influence it. So we're gonna hit disabled, but there is an exception to this. We do want it to be influenced by both administrators as well as purchasing managers, because those are the people on the approval workflow that will have the ability to change the status to approved or rejected. So we do need to set conditions. And we're going to do that if we go up here. We're going to see this visual builder like we showed for the single state. If I open that, so the record we don't need to influence, but we do need to set this field. And the field is going to be, we're going to select user role. And the reason for that is we're going to be specifying that if the role that the person is in is either an administrator or is a purchasing manager, then this will not apply to them. So we're going to select, instead of any of, we want to say none of. So none of these 2 roles we're going to select. And we're going to do that by going to selection and clicking this little button. And we have all these roles available to us. So one is administrator. So we're going to select that. And the manager, the purchasing manager is down here a bit. This is the demo account name. And then we have purchasing manager. So we're going to select that. We're going to hit done. We could have selected more if we wanted to, but in this case, those are the 2 that we want to have as the ability to change that approval status. So we're going to hit add on that. And and we're gonna hit save. So we've now set conditions for this aspect or action where this approval status is going to be disabled except for these two roles. So we've set that all, we're all fine with that. We're gonna hit save on that. And we've now got our three actions. We've added a button for approve, we've added it for rejected, and we've made it so it's disabled for everyone except for the administrator and the purchasing manager. So this is all exactly as we want. So we're gonna hit save on that. And we've got that pending approval. So now I want to get from pending approval to, let's say we'll go to approved first. So I'm gonna click this and I'm gonna draw it down to the approved state. You can do the same thing within these records to create a transition, but I find it's easier just to grab them and drag them around. It's as easy as I just showed you. So we've created now this transition, and if you double click on that, you click on the line itself, it will allow you to influence what this transition is doing. So there's really two ways that we can get from the pending approval to the approved state. And one method would simply be the fact that if the purchase order itself is under $1,000, it should just immediately go to the approved state because it doesn't need to go through an approval. And then the second option is going to be the fact that the approve button gets selected will take it from pending approval to approved. So let's do that first transition here where we're just specifying that the thing is under $1,000. So we're going to go over here and we're going to say, yes, it is going to the approved state. And we're fine with these transitions and event types and contexts, but what we do want to specify is the condition. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to specify that the field is going to be total amount, and it has to be less than $1,000. Add. Good, so we're gonna hit save on that. So we basically specified that if this thing has a total amount under $1,000, in that condition, it goes straight to approval. It doesn't need to do anything else. So we're gonna come down here and we're gonna hit save on that transition. And now we're gonna draw a second transition. So we can see it to the right here, and we're gonna double click on that. And in this case, we're gonna specify that it only goes to the approval state by having that button selected as approve. So instead of going through these conditions, we're gonna go down to execute on button, and we're gonna select, out of the two buttons we made, it gives us them as options, and we're gonna select approve. And we'll go down here and we'll hit save. So now that we've specified those two transitions, now I'm gonna click on this approved state, and I'm gonna add an action. And what I'm trying to do here is basically, if this purchase order has been approved, I want this approval status to say approved. I want it to now default to that status. So I'm gonna go back here and I'm gonna add an action, and I'm going to do set field value. And it brings us down here. All of these fields are fine in this instance. So the field that I'm trying to influence is the approval status. So I'm gonna do approval status. And in this case, it's gonna be static because if we've made it to this approval state, we're fine with it being a static value of approved. So out of the selection, we're gonna click this list of options. It's either approved, open, pending approval, or rejected. So in this case, we wanna go with approved. So I'm gonna click on that, and we're just gonna say that the approval status is approved, and that's it. We're gonna hit save on that. The only other thing I wanna do as an action is I'm gonna create another action. In this case, I wanna lock record. See that here? So we've clicked lock record. Basically what that's gonna specify is once this purchase order has been approved and has reached that state, I wanna lock it off. I don't want people editing it. Now, you might not want that in your instance. And one thing to keep in mind is that this approval workflow that I'm creating is by no means gospel or the only way you can set up an approval status. This is just one way to set this up. They can get quite more elaborate. They can have other parameters or triggers that are going through, but I'm just giving a very, very simple example of an approval workflow. And in my simple example, I do want it to hit that approval state and be locked without any further editing. So now I can look through this. All these statuses that are currently set are totally fine. I'm gonna hit save. So now I've created an action where it's locking the record, and I can see that here. The last thing I want to do with this workflow state is over here, do not exit workflow. And I'm going to click that. And what that's going to do is basically, it's going to add a little symbol. It's basically saying that once it hits that point, it's not going to go beyond that. It's not going to revolve back into the workflow. It's not going to go anywhere else beyond that exact state. It's going to stop at that exact place, and it's not going to exit beyond it. And I'm going to hit save on that. And that becomes more relevant. I'm going to do the exact same action when I hit the rejected status. And the reason that's important is because, for example, if you wanted to loop back, let's say on rejection, if you wanted to loop back and be able to go again through that approval status, you would not want to select that because you'd want it to be able to circle back in. But in this case, for both the approval and you'll see when I hit the rejected status, I want it to just stop at that point. If someone's going to have to go through a new approval, I'd want them to generate a new purchase order. In this example, you might not want that for your own, but for this one, that's exactly how I'm going to set it up. So you can see here this symbol with the little arrows shows that it's not going to be able to go beyond this point. Now that we've set up the approval side of things, let's set up the reject side. So first off, let's set the trigger. I'm going to drag a trigger from the pending approval to the rejected, and I'm going to double click on it to edit that trigger. And in this case, I'm going to specify that it's going to execute on a button, which is going to be reject, just like I did for approval. As soon as it's rejected or clicked as rejected, it's going to go to the rejected state. So I've set that trigger, or that transition, I should say. And now I'm going to go over to rejected, and I'm going to double click on that. And I'm going to do a similar thing that I did for the approval status. So I'm going to set the action as set field value. And the field is going to be approval status. And in this case, I'm going to set it statically as being rejected. So I'm going to go to the list, and I'm selecting rejected. And then I'm going to go down and I'm going to save that. And again, I want to lock it off. I don't want it to be further edited at this point. So I'm going to hit lock record as my second action. I'm going to scroll down. I'm fine with all these settings. They're the defaults. So it's totally fine. So I'm going to hit save on that. And now I've created this set field value as rejected, and I've locked the record. The last thing I want to do, again, is this do not exit workflow. So that's going to prevent it from looping back in or going anywhere else. It's just going to stop it at that point. So now I have pending approval down to approval if it's under $1,000 or if that button's been selected. And if it's selected as rejected, it's going to move on to that rejected approval state. So at this point, I've created a workflow that is an approval workflow. So by hitting save on all of those different things, I've actually, again, the release status was released. So this workflow is now in action. So let's actually test it out and see if it works correctly. We're going to go up to this purchase order. Now, before I select anything on this, I actually do want to refresh this because I've made changes to this item. For example, we don't see any buttons here. So let's actually refresh this purchase order form. And notice we have approve and rejected. Now, they aren't editable at this point because we haven't even created a purchase order. So there's nothing to approve or edit or reject at this point. So they are grayed out, but you can see that those buttons are now available. Now, if we come over to approval status, notice it is not disabled like we set in our workflow. And the reason for that is because I am in the administrator role. So if I was in, for example, a purchaser role, this field would be set as disabled. I wouldn't be able to change that at all. So in this case, let's make a mock purchase order that's going to fulfill our needs. So we're going to do just any random vendor, and I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to just add any particular item. It doesn't really matter. So I've selected this item. Now this item is $230, so it would not trigger that $1,000 purchase order approval. So we're simply going to change the quantity. We're going to add several quantities. So this is now over that amount. So I'm going to hit add on that. And if I come up here, notice my total is over $1,000. So this will now trigger that workflow. So I'm fine from this. The only other thing I need to do is hit the location. So I'm going to set it as Boston. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to hit save. All right, so we've now gotten to this point, and now you can see I have this approve and reject button, and it says pending approval. So I now have this ability to move it forward on this workflow, and it has started on it. So in this case, I do want to hit approve and specify that this is able to go to that approved state. And suddenly we now have an approved purchase order, and you can see it says pending receipt. And notice you have certain things like the approval status is set as approved. Remember, we defaulted it to approved if that button was selected, and all of these fields are no longer editable. So this thing has been locked as a record, and I would not be able to go in and start changing details with it. So in just a matter of minutes, we were able to successfully set up a multi-state workflow and verify that it is operating correctly. So if you found this video helpful, hit the like button, subscribe if you want to watch future videos, and leave me a comment if there's any particular video you'd like me to make. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.